Well, good morning, everyone, and thanks for the invite to Southern Louisiana. You know, I'm a big fan of your cuisine down here, and I'm really looking forward to some fresh crawfish étouffée this afternoon and some red beans and andouille sausage. So when it's April or May in Louisiana, I'm looking for an opportunity to come on down south. You know, I feel a little bit like we're bound at the hips, Oklahoma and Louisiana today, because of our work on the HALO project. HALO, of course, stands for Hydrogen in Arkansas, Louisiana, and Oklahoma. I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment, but it's certainly given me an opportunity to get well acquainted with your great staff down here. Louisiana's DNR Secretary Tom Harris and Jason Lankos, and of course, I've known Chuck Carr-Brown for a number of years back through our work at EPA. I always look forward to getting down here and getting, regaled a bit by the Boudreaux and Thibodeau stories. And I'm looking forward to hearing some of those again today. Well, the first question that you have in your mind is, why is an Okie down here in Louisiana talking about clean fuels? Well, I'm a little bit of an apostle or a disciple of what we're doing in Oklahoma, because a lot of people don't know how progressive Oklahoma has become in the renewable fuel space. So I want to talk to you about what we've been doing in Oklahoma. But since I had your state capitol on my prior slide, I wanted to talk about our state capitol a little bit. This particular photograph was taken in 1939, and I want to call your attention to a couple of things in the photograph. First of all, this is what I call the version of our topless capitol. When the capitol was built, the legislature allocated $1.5 million in 1914 to build this place, and when they got underway, they discovered that they did not have enough money to put a dome on the capitol, so they left the capitol flat-topped. And so it was that way for many years. But the other, probably more important thing I want to point out to you is, if you look carefully, you see oil derricks in front of the Capitol and all around the Capitol. In fact, I counted 10 different oil derricks in this photograph. And I think when you think historically about Oklahoma, this is the first thing that comes to mind. We've been an oil and gas producer, significant oil and gas producer, since before statehood in 1907. And we continue to be a significant oil and gas producer today. But as we look to the future, I think we're starting to explore other alternative fuels. In fact, our governor, if he was here, would tell you that Oklahoma is dedicated to an all-of-the-above approach. So we're not picking and choosing any energy sources. We're not only all of the above, but we're more of the above. We know that energy security is critically important, and that's been underlined by the Ukrainian-Russian crisis that just took place. So unless the country has their own independent fuel source to rely upon, then you're going to be somewhat at risk. And as we look at some of the current developments that are taking place in the Middle East with the discussions between Saudi Arabia and Iran, those sources of crude oil that we've relied upon for many years may not be as reliable as they used to be. So I wanted to share with you the picture of the current capitol that sits in Oklahoma City. And as you can see, for the centennial celebration, we raised through private funds enough money to finally get the dome on the capitol. But you'll notice the derrick that was sitting there in 1939 is still sitting there today. In fact, this state capitol is the only one in the nation that sits on top of an active oil and gas field. And if you drive just down Lincoln Boulevard a little bit from the Capitol, you'll still see that pump jacks are running and workover rigs are working. So that's been our history, and it's been a good history, but let's look at what may be coming down the road. So I don't know if you follow Sarah Week, but Sarah Week happened in Houston about a month ago. And I wasn't there, but I know some of our Louisiana folks were there. As I looked through the headlines, this was one that really caught my eye. Pioneer Resources is a large independent oil company primarily doing business out in the Permian Basin of West Texas and New Mexico. And he made a rather, in some view, radical statement that the U.S. probably will never see peak oil again. So I remember back to my academic training that we had a lot of discussion about this PhD named M. King Herbert. And Mr. Herbert was a PhD from University of Chicago in geoscience and mathematics. Very bright guy. If you look at his resume, he's accomplished a whole number of significant papers and technical articles over the years. Born in 1903, died in 1986. Well, in 1956, 30 years before he died, he presented a paper that talked about peak oil. And I'm going to slide here to the next page. And what we have here in green is the U.S. oil production from 1920 to present. And in the box up to the left, in the red line, that was the professor's calculation at what our oil production might look like. And so in 1956, he was 20, 30 years ahead of where peak oil occurred. And so he lived long enough to actually see peak oil that happened in the 1970s when the Alaska production came online. And he lived long enough that he didn't see the upturn that happened in 2010. So when I speak about crude oil production, I always remind people that this is a finite resource. And it's incumbent upon us to keep in mind that crude oil is a finite resource. As we look at decarbonization and moving forward, crude oil and natural gas are going to play critical roles in the future economy. But as we move forward to 2035 and 2050, there's simply going to be less crude oil available in the U.S., and so that's incumbent upon us to think about what alternative fuels might be available into the future. Now, where the professor missed his projection, and it started in 2005, his calculation was based on the fact that every oil and gas field in the world had been discovered in 1956. And that's how he grew this basis of this bell-shaped curve to predict what long-term oil production was. What he didn't realize and what he did not live to see was the technical advances that happened between 2000 and 2010, mainly in the aspects of hydraulic fracturing, hydraulic stimulation, and horizontal drilling. And these two technical advancements opened up a whole number of reservoirs that the professor would have never thought could possibly have been productive. So you see in 2010, we were down to about 5 million barrels a day. And through the application of these two technologies together, we grew to 13 million barrels per day pre-COVID in just a short 10 years. And from an oil production standpoint, that's just really an extraordinary accomplishment. But when we think of Professor Hubbard's predictions, and this is, I just cut out that previous chart, from 2010 to 2023, there's some interesting lessons here that I think are blaring their message home to us about oil production. First of all, we reached that 13 million barrels per day, first time ever in the history of oil production in the United States, just pre-COVID. And then you know what happened with COVID. People stayed at home, wells weren't getting drilled, production wasn't coming online, and look what happened to the production in the United States. We went from 13 million a day down to 9 million a day in just a matter of months. That's roughly 25% of our total U.S. oil production that we lost in those few months. And the reason for this, and this is why it's particularly instructive as we think where oil production is going to go as an energy source in the future, is that the wells that we're drilling today, that are horizontal wells and hydraulically stimulated, recover roughly 70% of their total reserves in the first 3 years. So if you've seen a production curve of a typical horizontal well producing, you will see that they come in at gangbuster IPs or initial potentials, but they go on a screaming decline. And so that's what exactly we see here during COVID is without the drilling, we saw how susceptible our U.S. oil production is if we don't keep drilling. And as we go forward, the wells that we're drilling probably aren't going to be as good as they have been in the past, because if we're good petroleum engineers, we always pick our best prospects first. So that's the other thing that worries me as I look at oil production going in the future is if you look at 2016 to 2019, you see a pretty rapid increase in oil production that I've indicated there in that red line. If you curve fit post-COVID, you see that our increasing in oil production is much less than it was pre-COVID. So this really begs the question of what are we going to do in the future for energy supplies? Well, in Oklahoma, we've got a couple of things at work that I want to show you. But before we do, I thought I'd show you what Oklahoma crude oil production looks like, and this is where it's very concerning to us. Is pre-COVID, we reached a high of about 620,000 barrels of oil per day. Today, we're at 425,000 barrels per day, and we're not picking up steam very fast. And if we look at Louisiana's production, its production profile looks more like what you would see in California, and that is just kind of a long terminal decline. So I think it's incumbent upon all of us to think about what are we going to do in the next 50 years for energy supply, and particularly in the context of domestic energy supply. So most people are just totally surprised when I tell them that our electrical generation in Oklahoma has changed radically in the last 20 years. This chart shows what the percentage of wind generation is for our total power consumption in Oklahoma. So last April, a year ago this month, we reached an all-time high in wind generation of 65% of our power usage in Oklahoma for the entire month was generated by wind. We have an installed capacity of wind today in Oklahoma that's roughly twice what our consumptive needs are. And so when you think of wind, that really makes sense because wind in Oklahoma only blows about 50 or 52% of the time. So you need twice that installed capacity to get a complete generation profile. So on a windy day in Oklahoma, we generate the entirety of our electrical needs with wind. And so that allows us to utilize some of that electrical energy for other purposes. And as we look to the future, we're thinking that hydrogen is going to be a great opportunity to utilize some of this surplus capacity. Quite frankly, our challenge in Oklahoma is that our wind corridor is basically on the west side of the state. If you know Oklahoma geography, Interstate 35 runs from Oklahoma City to Dallas, pretty much divides the state into east and west. And in 2005, 2006, all of the wind turbines that would have been built at that time would have been west of I-35. But today, with technology advancements in wind turbines, just like the technology advances we saw in horizontal drilling and hydraulic stimulation, turbines today are able to operate in areas where they weren't originally able to operate. So the evolution that's taking place in turbines make it possible to generate wind energy in areas that weren't considered optimal back 20 years ago. So now today, if you look at a map of wind generation in Oklahoma, what you'll see is huge complexes west of I-35, but you'll see the wind turbines are creeping east of I-35 and moving into eastern Oklahoma. So I wanted to take a quick look at our electrical generation profile in 2022 in Oklahoma. And there's a couple of interesting points here to make. Probably most significantly is this 2022, the entire yearly average, is the first time in the entire states' history that our electricity generated by wind exceeded our generation by natural gas. Very significant accomplishment. And if we look at the history of this, I think it's pretty instructive. If we go back to the pre-wind period, we see that about 60% of our total electricity was generated by coal. And you can see what's happened with coal over time. It's basically being retired. If you were filling up your Tesla with Oklahoma electricity in 2022, only about 10% of that electricity would have been generated by coal. And so wind, as you can see, last year surpassed natural gas, and it's become a significant contributor to power generation in Oklahoma. So what does this do for clean fuel? So I took a stab at calculating carbon intensity. So you all will know that each fuel source emits a certain number of pounds of CO2 for each BTU that's generated. And so I took those individual numbers for coal and for natural gas and for biomass and all the rest of our inputs into our electricity and calculated this curve. And what I found was that back in the pre-wind era, our electricity, our carbon intensity of our electrical power generation was 1,753 pounds of CO2 generated for each megawatt hour. And with this change in our portfolio generation, that's come down to 664. So in the totality of our electrical generation in Oklahoma, we've seen a 61% decrease in the carbon intensity required to generate our power. I haven't had the time to calculate this for all the states, but I suspect this is at the top of the list among states that are seeking to increase their carbon intensity. In fact, when you get down into the 400 pounds of CO2 range, then you're really talking about the areas that we need to be for decarbonization. So how does Oklahoma stack up with everyone else? Well, our friends that border us to the south, the Republic of Texas, is hard to get ahead of simply because of the wide amount of geography they have to work with. So catching up with Texas is certainly going to be a challenge. But we're working on catching up with Iowa. In 2022, Oklahoma was the third largest producer of wind energy in the United States. I think many people are surprised to learn this. And if you look on down the chart there, you see other states that would love to be in this position, like California, Colorado, other states who are pursuing the clean energy. And then the next chart I want to show is how much of that wind energy was represented the totality of the power that was used in the state. So Oklahoma ranks fourth in its penetration of wind energy as a percentage of the total amount of power that's used. And I think this will continue. You know, Oklahoma from a renewable standpoint is 98% wind. We have very little PV, but we have a lot of PV projects that have been announced and are coming on the board. I look at this as making lemonade out of lemons. You know, we have a state song that talks about the wind comes sweeping down the plains. And for many years, you know, that was a curse to the farmers because it dried out their fields and, you know, adds to a whole number of problems. But now, today, as we move into this next area of talking about power generation, we really figured out a way to harness the wind in a useful, practical, and meaningful way. So what are we doing with all of this electricity that we generate by wind in Oklahoma? Our challenge is that our production is on the west side of the state. Most of our load is on the east side of the state. So today, we're challenged as are many places, with getting electricity from where it's needed to where it's produced. And so in Oklahoma, we have several 500 kilovolt DC lines on the drawing board, but what we need from our federal government is some help in expediting permitting and regulatory regime so that we can get these power lines built quicker. In the meantime, one of the important considerations, I think, for all of this surplus wind that's getting generated out west is taking a careful look at using that wind energy to generate hydrogen through electrolysis. And I don't want to get too far into the weeds there because I know Jason's going to be here tomorrow to talk about the HALO effort, but the hydrogen in Arkansas, Louisiana, and Oklahoma has been an intense effort this past year to secure funding from DOE. DOE has made available $7 billion to grow a hydrogen ecosystem across the United States. And there are a number of uses of hydrogen. Some of them are better than others, quite frankly. Louisiana today is one of the two largest producers of hydrogen in the United States. But the issue with the hydrogen that's produced today is the CO2 from the byproduct is just vented to the atmosphere, so it doesn't produce necessarily a clean product. So what we're looking to do for the gray hydrogen that's produced today is change it to blue hydrogen so that that CO2 byproduct is sequestered and stored in the subsurface. Louisiana, in fact, today is in the forefront of Region 6 in getting federal delegation for the Class 6 UIC wells, which are used to sequester carbon dioxide. But as I think about all of the uses for hydrogen, one that comes to mind that I think has a lot of benefit is looking at fueling 18-wheelers. And as we think about electrolyzers located out in these large wind fields, if we can liquefy the hydrogen that's made there, then that makes it feasible, economically feasible, to transport that hydrogen 400 to 500 miles from the site that it's generated. So with that distance, it's possible to cover a large number of fueling stations across the state. So about a year ago, the three governors of Oklahoma signed an MOU that set up this HALO project. I want to give you a quick review of what's going on. There were 79 different groups. Some of these were industries, some of these were state coalitions that came together and submitted an application to DOE. That happened last November. DOE looked through those 79 applications and narrowed those down to 33 and asked those 33 to submit a final application. HALO was one of those 33 that was invited to submit a final application, and that application was due on April 7th. DOE has indicated that they plan to choose somewhere between 6 and 10 projects to fund. So if we're successful in landing this funding, that should be roughly $1.25 billion to help grow the hydrogen ecosystem here in the South. The DOE expects to make their final selection in fall of 2023, so I don't know if that's September 21st or December 21st or somewhere in between there, knowing how the federal government works. It's probably going to be closer to December 1st. We've had almost 100 different companies express interest in the HALO, and we've had about 70 companies that signed NDAs and submitted projects for consideration for HALO. A number of our companies have participated in multiple hubs application, and as they look at the process that we've gone through, they're all very complimentary of the process and the ideas that we put forth. What we see across the hydrogen economy is we have lots and lots of people who are willing to build the facilities to manufacture the hydrogen. The challenge is developing consumption for that hydrogen, and that's really what our HALO application has focused on, is building a hydrogen ecosystem so that we can utilize all of this capacity that can be built to supply this. Well, Oklahoma has been in the forefront of establishing clean corridors for quite some time. The first clean fuel corridor we applied for was for CNG. Back in the prior governor's administration, Governor Fallon bought almost 2,000 state vehicles that were CNG fired. We've got a fairly widespread fueling network across the state. So that was really the first corridor that we put into place. We're right on the cusp of submitting applications for designation of clean fuel corridors for hydrogen. And you'll know that the requirements for the clean fuel corridors have requirements that are based on what fuel you're using. And for EVs, that means you have to have a fueling station every 50 miles. For hydrogen, you have to have a fueling station every 150 miles, so you can get a little farther down the road. But these are our plans for designating at least the first go-around of clean fuel corridors in Oklahoma, primarily geared to looking at where the 18-wheel truck traffic predominates, in addition to connecting to the clean fuel corridors that have been designated in adjacent states. One of our prior efforts was the Oklahoma EV Clean Corridor. Back in 2018, we elected to utilize a significant amount of the VW money that was available to install EV chargers across the state. And in 2019, 2020, and 2021, Oklahoma, on a per capita basis, was first in the nation at rolling out EV stations across the state. In 2022, geography works against you sometimes. California has actually crept ahead of us now from the standpoint of installing these EV stations. But Oklahoma, I think it's important to recognize that we've been open to all of the alternative fuels during the course of their evolution. First with CNG, second with EV, and now with hydrogen. So I want to talk a little bit now about what some of the regulatory issues that we may be facing in addressing clean air as we go forward. And this is going to take probably a bit to bring up this slide because I have 540,000 data points on this slide. There. So in Oklahoma, well, you know that EPA has 6 criteria air pollutants. In Oklahoma, there are 2 of those that are particularly pesky for us. One is ozone and one is particulate matter. So I asked our air department, I said, send me your ozone measurements. What they ended up sending me was their hourly measurements for our 10 or 12 stations for the last 5 or 6 years. So what we're seeing here is basically our readings that we're taking for ozone across Oklahoma, about 540,000 unique points scattered over the last 5 or 6 years. A couple of things here that just jump out at you. First of all, you see that ozone is a bigger problem in the summertime than in the wintertime. That's not really new news, but because of that, we only operate one of our ozone monitors year-round. The rest of the monitors are operated on a seasonal basis through the summer season. But the reason I mention this is that the 2015 ozone standard put ground level ozone at 0.07 parts per million or 70 parts per billion. And we do not have any non-attainment areas in Oklahoma currently. even though we have some hourly exceedances, you all will know that that EPA's criteria for determining non-attainment I would describe as a little bit quirky. For ozone, what they do is they take the fourth highest daily maximum 8-hour concentration averaged over 3 years. And when you get into that dilemma that's exceeding the 70, then you're facing the prospects of non-attainment. Louisiana, Oklahoma are both in attainment. Our friends to the west of here and to the south of me, the Republic of Texas, is having some fairly significant challenges with ozone. DFW is now a moderate designation, which is second above. El Paso is marginal, Houston is moderate, and San Antonio is moderate. So as we think about the EPA and how they have looked at ozone levels over the last 30 years, they are, I think, going to bump this level down. That's my personal opinion of how I'm reading the tea leaves. But they're required to look at each of the criteria pollutants every 5 years and determine whether they're acceptable or whether they need to be changed. Very rarely do they go up. Almost always they go down. So the goalpost on air quality is one of those things that appears to be constantly changing. As we look at our 8-hour ozone measurements across Oklahoma, you know, we had 50 in 2018 that exceeded the 0.07, but none of them fell into the fourth scenario with the 3-year average. But the thing that caught my eye here was that one of the upsides of COVID is it's had one of the most profound impacts of improving air quality of anything else that's been done. If you look at 2019, 2020, and even into 2021, while people were staying home and not driving their vehicles, we saw a significant improvement in air quality. And finally, I want to pull up the next graph, and I mentioned ozone simply because we have some monitors in Oklahoma City that have been at 70 or 71 parts per billion for the last 2 years. So during this next summer, if we see them at that level, you know, we may be looking at a non-attainment designation. More importantly, if EPA were to choose to lower their ozone levels from even 70 to 69 or 68, then I think we in Oklahoma would be significantly challenged with looking at a lot of potential attainment. The other thing I wanted to mention that's a problem for us in Oklahoma is PM 2.5. PM 2.5 actually has two levels that the EPA looks at in determining attainment. One of those is an annual average. The annual average cannot exceed 12 micrograms per cubic meter. And then there's also a 3-year average of the daily 24 averages, not to exceed 35 micrograms per meter cubed. So EPA is already making quite a bit of noise and accepting public comment on the first one of these parameters, which is the 12 micrograms per meter cubed. And if you look at this chart, you can see that the individual measurements are, a lot of them is above that 12. And if we look at averaging those exceedances, and these exceedances of that is what we really watch closely to see if we're following into the attainment category or not. But if we see a reduction in PM 2.5 from the 12 level to even the 11 or the 10 or 9 that's being discussed, we're going to see some significant impacts across the economy. And while this is great for improving air quality, it's going to have particularly significant impacts for diesel fuel trucks, because diesel fuel trucks is one of the larger emitters of PM 2.5. So I think as we look at how the goalposts are moving for air quality standards, it's incumbent on us, important for us, to consider future fuel sources that can make sure we stay out of these attainment designations. If your state is interested in economic development, for example, being in a non-attainment area is a curse of death, because new industries locating there have to make additional considerations in order to meet the emissions requirements. So being in a non-attainment area is very significant, and we're working to make sure we stay there. As we look at new fuel sources, this is one of the reasons that I'm very optimistic that hydrogen can help us out on the heavy haul truck fueling. I was in Stillwater, Oklahoma, home of Oklahoma State University, a week ago. Friday, the Energy Secretary was there making a award to the university for some of their work. We had an opportunity to visit with her a few minutes before the ceremony started. Couldn't get any inside information on the hydrogen selection process, but when I returned to Tulsa, and what you all may not know about Oklahoma State is they have two campuses, one in Stillwater, one in Tulsa. They run a bus service between those two multiple times per day. And as I left Stillwater, I happened to be following one of those buses. And the thing that I noticed was I was just honestly being covered up with PM emissions coming out of the back of the bus. And I thought, those need to be on our first list to look at replacing with hydrogen fueling capability. So those are some thoughts I wanted to share with you about Oklahoma's progress in the renewable energy space and what we're doing to encourage the use of renewable energy, what we're doing to really be proactive about thinking through the future. And if we have time, I'm happy to take any questions.